Well, Dr. Simpkin, I have been looking forward to having this conversation for a long time. We had a pleasure of meeting a long time ago, and I've enjoyed your work on military strategy, ballistic missile systems. I enjoy your series on the readings that you'll do on Moby Dick, on Wuthering Heights, on War and Peace. The contributions that you give on microliberations to the overall conversation that's going on in the world today are very insightful. I am a big fan of people that can find this beautiful and artful space between technical and particular detail about a subject, but then the overall big picture philosophical implications that brings. And I find that you do such an excellent job of that. Your series where you're talking about on drone ethics is magnificent. The article that you shared on ballistic missile systems was fascinating. And again, since I do so much in Hegel, Hegel has that idea of abstraction, negation, concretion. And I like to say that in Hegel, an idea isn't even really an idea until it's made concrete. And there's something about military technology or military strategy where ideas show how much they have consequences. The idea to invent a certain sort of technology then is brought into the world, say the ballistic missile system, that then transforms the entire horizon of global interaction. So an idea is, one of the reasons I love this subject is it really does show you how quote unquote practical ideas are. We tend to divide the world between ideas and practice, but here you see how they come together so much. And that to me is that concretion stage in Hegel. But anyway, Mr. Simpkin, please, just to talk about your work, your interests, the book that you're doing, congratulations, my goodness. And I believe you're in West Yorkshire, so thank you for talking with me here in Virginia today. And I just tell us about your work, your interests, and again, it's just really wonderful to have you here, Mr. Simpkin. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Daniel. I'm delighted to be here and to chat with you in person. As we've met many times in the past, but never one-to-one, and I've been following your work, etc. And the numinous and the familial, as we've talked about. But yeah, my name's James. I'm a teacher by trade. I'm not quite sure how it fits in the American context, but I suppose the easiest way to explain it is I'm like a high school teacher, teaching 16-year-olds plus. I teach civics and a bit of international relations. But for the past 7 years, because I was doing it part-time, I was completing my PhD on the relationship between the United States and Britain over ballistic missile defence as it related to the last Labour government. I completed that in April 2021, and then the past several months I've been working on my manuscript to get that submitted to Routledge, and I did that a month or so ago, and thanks, and I'm waiting for their feedback on that to see, that's going to be several months more, but it's in the pipeline, so maybe before the end of the year that'll be out.
Wow, well, congratulations, my goodness.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, and I suppose, if you were to ask me why ballistic missile defence, what is so fascinating about it? Well, in essence, it's the biggest military project in the world, in history, that you've never heard of. Sources, if you look at the Congressional Budget Office reports, up until the last few years, between the 1950s when this really took off up until now, the United States has spent $400 billion on ballistic missile defense, trying to get the system to work. To put that in a bit of context, in today's money, the Manhattan Project only cost $23 billion.
Wow.
The Apollo moon landings only cost $230 billion. So, the ballistic missile defense dwarfs these two massive projects by an order of magnitude. And why is that? So often people will talk about ballistic missile defense as though it's trying to hit a bullet with a bullet. It's actually way harder than that. A rifle bullet will travel at 4 kilometers a second. Ballistic missiles, when they're in full flight, are traveling at 7 kilometers a second. So it takes this gigantic computational power, firepower, rocketry, to try and make this system work. Now, as it exists at the moment, there are two bases in North America which have these huge missiles called ground-based interceptors, which would be able to defend the United States from North Korea. So one of them is Fort Greely, Alaska, and the other one is at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. And there are about 40 of these ground-based interceptors. They're huge missiles, you know, the size of a bus. And if North Korea had the capability, which it doesn't have at the moment, but if they had the capability to fire ICBMs, you know, intercontinental ballistic missiles at the United States, the United States could easily shoot them down. Even though the system has obviously never been tested, because we've never had, you know, North Korea fire on the United States, fortunately, it probably could do that. And there is also a European half of this, which is more of a NATO system. And there are various sites. There's a site in Romania, which has some smaller missiles, which could deal with sort of medium range missiles from the east. Now, they're not targeted at Russia. They were meant to put there to counter an emerging threat from Iran, which hasn't quite materialized. And on June the 5th, there is going to be a new interceptor base coming live in Poland. So we'll wait to see what the reaction of Russia is to that. Now, how does this relate to me in West Yorkshire, as you mentioned? Well, about 20 miles from here, where I am, there is a radar base called RAF Menwith Hill, and it's a strange looking thing. I don't know if you've ever seen these radar bases. They look like gigantic golf balls. They're sort of huge geodesic domes. And so there's that there, and then up on the coast near the seaside, near Scarborough, about 50 miles away, there's another site called RAF Fylingdales, which is a radar base. And both those sites, you know, I've seen them many times. I've driven past them many times growing up and on the way to the seaside. So that kind of sparked that interest in me many years ago. Then probably being kind of like a Star Trek fan and interested in that kind of thing. And then as getting older into my later teens, 20s, and going to university and being more interested in politics and party politics and how this related to New Labour and Tony Blair. And, you know, the same kind of era as Bill Clinton and the New Democrats and New Labour trying to portray themselves as being harsher on defence, because it was always an issue which the Conservatives in the UK or the Republicans in America could portray, you know, centre-left parties as being unpatriotic, let's say. So, you know, that's what led into the politics side of things. But literally, yeah, I'll pause there for a moment. Actually, that's sort of the background. I can explain some of the technical aspects as we get into this. But well, yeah, that would draw me to that.
Well, that is outstanding. Well, one of the things that I found very interesting in your article, Under the Radar, which was explaining the Labour's ballistic missile defense policy, 1997 through 2010. I found it very interesting, this idea that Labour Party becomes increasingly more, quote unquote, conservative in regard to its ballistic missile policy. And I find that very, very interesting, because here in the States, there's almost been more of, well, before Russia, you know, now things have changed, but before that, there was almost gradually a movement away from, you know, ballistic missile defense politically and different things like that. And it's interesting for me to see how over in the UK, there's actually this movement toward the center. And I'm curious for the cultural reasons why. You know, America, for example, has never had to worry about a direct invasion, say, whereas in Europe, obviously, that has been a concern. And so it's interesting to think how different cultural backgrounds can contribute to the subconscious. Because what's so interesting, too, once you get into politics, you're also getting into psychology. You're getting to how people think. And then, of course, the question becomes, why do people think the way that they think? And that can be very, very complex. You know, you were just mentioning these childhood experiences that create a certain interest, right? Where people can have childhood experiences where their grandfather is telling them about World War II and, you know, how they felt, and that kind of sits in their subconscious. And maybe if asked directly, they can't tell you why they support increasing ballistic missile defenses, but that is why. And to me, you know, I was mentioning at the introduction how I'm very interested between the movement between philosophical big picture thinking and in the technical. There's something about politics, although I am no politician, and I obviously can't say I'm a fan of it very much, but there's something actually very concrete and important about politics, because it's this meeting ground between how people think and the skin in the game that they have to put in regard to what they think. You know, it's one thing for me to say that I have a great idea for a new ice cream flavor. It's entirely something else for me to put $10 million down into starting the business of that ice cream flavor. We actually find out if I really think it's a good idea if I put the money onto it, because there's consequences, right? And so likewise, when people vote a certain way or a certain policy comes into power, suddenly there's skin in the game, and that transforms everything. And I find this very interesting. Because when it comes to military strategy, you're always kind of dealing with the realm of ideas that have skin in the game. And that completes an entire, in my view, that creates a very different relationship to ideas and possibilities than, say, most people are used to. You know, most people may sit down, you know, even us philosophically inclined people can be guilty of this, you know, sitting down and talking about different ideas of justice and what we should do with the economy. Oh, we should raise interest rates to 4% and stabilize inflation. Oh, we ought to invite Poland and Finland into NATO, you know, the NATO and different things. But you see, we're not the ones actually making the decisions at dinner, right? We're not the ones who are actually doing it. So your emotional relationship to the ideas is quite different from, say, the military general or the politician who will be making the decision. And then you exist in the concrete reality where there is a missile defense system in Poland. And you are now dealing with the concrete reality of how Putin responds to the missile defense system in Poland. And for me, I think it's really important for people interested in philosophy to realize that different relationship to ideas. I think it would actually make us better thinkers as philosophers, honestly, to kind of think in terms of that concrete. And it would also transform our approach and maybe even take it more seriously in a beneficial way. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. The second thing that comes to mind is this kind of funny tension with military strategy. Whereas, you know, it's kind of like health. You know I'm supposed to eat better. I know I'm supposed to exercise, but I can get through maybe 50 years and then one day, boom, I have a heart attack. But you see, for so long, it's something I know I should do, but the consequences come much later. And then I have to deal with it. And then I'll start taking exercise seriously. Sometimes it feels like military, like defense, you're saying. Like you do a lot of work on defense to make it seem like you didn't need to do that work on defense. So you're kind of set up to always be, you know, to fail in a sense in the public's mind. Because, so for example, you build these missile defense systems. And that's precisely why you don't get the nuclear apocalypse, but you never see the alternative world where you don't have the nuclear apocalypse. So it always seems like you didn't have to do the military spending. So I find that's another thing that philosophically inclined people should take seriously, that kind of dilemma of doing your job well, looking like you didn't need to do your job. That's such an existentially funny tension. And I guess I was tying it to health, is that, you know, you can go on so long thinking you don't need to do exercise, and yeah, you're fine. Likewise, you don't need to spend on military for a long time, and yeah, you're fine. But then the day comes where it really matters. And when it matters, it might be like really bad, like super bad. And now it's too late. It makes me think of the Turkey example that Nassim Taleb gives in The Black Swan, where it goes through, you know, 364 days. It's eating, life is great. It's rational to stay in the pen, and then on Thanksgiving Day it gets its head cut off, you know, where this big event can occur that transforms rationality. And the last thing I'll say before passing it back to you, you know, you were talking about childhood. I was very lucky to grow up with my grandfather living next door, who served on the U.S. Iowa during World War II. And, you know, I basically lived on his porch. We ate watermelon about every night in the summer, especially. It was our favorite food. And, you know, and listened to all these stories. And one of the things, again, I appreciate about this subject and the work that you're doing is, for me, listening to these stories of war and conflict and the technologies actually helped me appreciate my everyday life. It helped me, you know, we've talked before, and we'll talk, you know, on the meaning crisis, how people are dealing with this feeling that life doesn't have meaning. What's the point, and different things like that. It was funny for me because just the knowledge that, you know, you could end up in World War II, or that a bomb could go off and blow everything away, actually made me appreciate life more. And that sounds kind of morbid in different things, but I always, you know, Johannes at the Halcon Guild, and I loved your presentation on Plato's Cave over there. You know, he'll talk about the connection between being and death and Heidegger and different things. And in a funny way, the knowledge of war and the knowledge of the ability of things to be lost actually, I think, can actually in a way help the meaning crisis, because you take things as more preciously. So those were some thoughts that came to mind as you were speaking.
No, yeah, I'll certainly circle back round to the philosophical. There's a lot that Heidegger can say about that. But just on that point, if you were talking about culture and a little bit of a history lesson. So, yeah, how does the cultural relate to the political in terms of ballistic missile defense? So, going further back, I get a bit cloudy. So, but basically, from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972 was a treaty which kind of froze the Cold War with the Soviets and the Americans not being able to build ballistic missile defense. It was around in the 1960s, but there were, at that time, Robert McNamara, etc., believed that it could be a spur to nuclear proliferation, because if you start building missile defense, suddenly the other side will start building like thousands of more missiles just to overwhelm it. So in 1972, there was a treaty between the Soviet Union and America to block that out. Now, getting more towards recent times, of course, with Reagan, you get this great renaissance in ballistic missile defense. Reagan had a very idealistic attitude towards ballistic missile defense. He wanted to, he was terrified of the idea of nuclear war, and he wanted to use ballistic missile defense as a way of reducing nuclear stockpiles. Actually, the idea that if you have a shield, you can get rid of your sword, so to speak. Now, there was a lot of advanced technology sort of mooted at that time, lasers in space, etc. But it basically did the job for the Russians without a shot being fired, because part of the technology that the Americans wanted to do with Star Wars, as it was called then under Reagan, SDI, it just led them to throw in the towel. They knew they could not compete with America on that front. Fast forward a little bit, we're getting to the 1990s and the George Bush Senior era, and we've got ballistic missile defense sort of still bubbling on, in the background, but it's not quite as serious. Then with Clinton, we get this cultural shift where Clinton is opposed to missile defense, but because by the 90s we're starting to get the rise of North Korea, etc., and Iran, there is a push from the Republicans in Congress, and particularly in sort of the midterm elections, I think in sort of 94, etc., when the Republicans take control of Congress, and then there's a big pressure put on Clinton to fund more ballistic missile defense. And that overlaps with the UK at the time, because there's that shared political space between Clinton and Blair, and they are both kind of resistant to ballistic missile defense. But because the Clinton administration is being pressured by Congress, there is this rising funding of missile defense. Then with the George Bush era, we really get the renaissance of ballistic missile defense. So again, we get this cultural shift where, America is definitely going to push forward with this. We really want to be able to counter North Korea, possibly China, definitely Iran. And by this time, Blair, and this is where the historical nature of it comes in, you can absolutely see where just like with the Iraq War, Blair is absolutely determined to try and keep the Americans on side and therefore maximise the UK's defence by really being behind ballistic missile defence. Changing tune completely from the 1990s, when it was very much aligned with Clinton, to now being very, very pro-ballistic missile defense. But in terms of culture, who is it that really, really cements ballistic missile defense as a factual, readily, physically embedded system? It's actually Obama. What Obama does when he comes in is he takes a lot of the ballistic missile defense technologies which have been developed under Bush, and as I mentioned, the systems in Alaska and California have already in place by sort of the mid-2000s. But he actually scraps a lot more of the sort of exotic technology, which was not very well tested. So lasers, this technology that I'm fascinated by called the airborne laser, which is basically you get an AWAC and you stick a laser on the front of it, and it's meant to loiter near the borders of a hostile country, so that as soon as they fire a missile, you can sort of shoot it down. That was kind of put to one side. But it's under Obama that we get the proposal for what he called the European phased adaptive approach, which was to build these sites, which are only now coming online in Poland and a few years ago in Romania. So the cultural aspect of it is, it's often, ballistic missile defense is often associated with conservatism, particularly in the United States, particularly with, as I've mentioned, particularly with Reagan, particularly with Bush Jr. But who has actually embedded it the most? Obama actually took the steps to make it a really existing NATO-ized kind of structure. And then into current years, Trump invested more in it. And then we're just waiting, actually, should be out very shortly, for the Biden administration's Missile Defense Review 2022 and what the Biden administration stamp will be on that. So that should be forthcoming very shortly. I believe it's with Congress. It's a classified document right now, but it's with Congress.
Well, that's fascinating. A few things come to mind. First off, I very much appreciate the knowledge that you have about the historic details and the technical details. I, as you know, in a lot of the papers and different things, like to talk about kind of the bigger picture, but actually the best emerges, again, Hegelian, a dialectic between you go into the nitty gritty and you come back, because again, I think what has occurred sometimes with philosophical thinkers, say, who will read their Kants and their Humes and their Hegels and different things, you tend to get kind of captured by that sort of topic and thinking, not in a bad way. We can't help but operate within some certain sphere of speciality and different things. But what can end up happening is kind of very, the same references can come up again and again, the same ideas can come up again and again, and you can kind of get siloed in that thinking. But you see, once you kind of become aware of, oh, wait a minute, actually the Obama administration was big on missile defense. Maybe there's a break between this, Thomas Sowell will talk about the conflict of visions, how you have these different axioms that conservatives operate, because Thomas Sowell, he's an American economist. He's really interested by this weird question of why is it, people who support, more military spending are also against abortion, are also free market. And he's like, it's kind of a bunch of random issues, and yet the same conservatives tend to have the same views on it. And he's like, that's really weird. And you can do the reverse with Democrats. And so he's like, there must be underlying axioms and visions of reality. He makes the difference between, I think it's the tragic vision and kind of I can't remember it's a tragic vision and a progressive vision, we will say, and how these visions create a coherent logic behind all of these different premises that don't seem to be related, and that you can't understand how people think unless you get to those different axioms. Well, here's the issue. What can happen if you get kind of captured in the same thinking, you may not get down to the axioms to see new ways that they are expressed. Somehow, for example, the progressive vision is okay with drone warfare. Obama had a lot of drone strikes. It's okay in some certain contexts with missile defense defense systems. Well, that's kind of strange, because classically you would associate the progressive vision with being against warfare and drones. So this is the point. What is the difference between, say, drone warfare or missile defense systems and classical warfare in the American democratic's mind? And I'm speaking from America here, because if you're only dealing with, say, certain books in a certain area, you may not notice this change. That's kind of interesting. That might be philosophically really, really rich and have a lot to say. And so that's an example of why I think it's so important to move between kind of big picture and technical thinking, if you will. That was a point. The other thing that I wanted to say is another thing that I'm critical of, in philosophy, there will be this talk of, say, the trolley problem or something like that. We need to really get rid of those kind of thought experiments and replace them with ballistic missile defense system, global multilateral trade agreements. right? Because there's actually, I think, a practical consequence of thinking about moral decisions so linearly and simplistically like a trolley problem that kind of hold themselves up as this paradigm of great ethical moral thinking, when really, that's kind of, I guess, a very linear problem. When you're talking about, ballistic missile defense systems, that's I guess, a multilateral decision. So much of geopoliticals is multilateral. Like, for example, whether or not we agree with this assessment or not, it's a different matter, but it makes the point. There's a lot of people arguing that, say, America leaving Afghanistan, told Russia that they could get away with certain things, and then Russia doing what they're doing, might infect China with Taiwan or in the South China Sea or so on and so forth. Rather or not all that is true or not is kind of not what I'm getting at. The point is who would have thought on the face of it that a decision about Afghanistan would have anything to do with Ukraine? But you see, on the global stage, it very much can. Who would have thought that the decision to increase missile defense systems could lead to an escalation? Who would have thought, for example, this was in your drone ethics series that I thought was so magnificent. Who would have thought that drone warfare could theoretically increase the likelihood of conflict because you remove the democratic protest? That's remarkable. And the point I was going to also make is that might be a hint at why the Obama administration seems to have been okay with drones, is because you remove the possibility of the democratic protest of people in the streets because soldiers' lives are not. That is a fascinating development. Whereas, again, going back to Thomas Sowell, in the past, the progressive vision would have been against warfare. Now that you have the possibility of warfare that takes out the soldier, they might be okay with warfare. That is a radical shift that is philosophically significant, I think. But the point I was getting at, and then I'll pass it back to you, is that I really, really am a big fan of replacing these simplistic moral thought experiments that we have in philosophy classrooms across the country, and that you see a lot of ethical, basically I would like ethical philosophy to take into account military strategy, basically replace it. Because if you're not doing that, sure, I don't want to say the trolley problem can't have use on an individual level for an individual moral decision, but that's only like level one. There's moral decisions for the autonomous individual, but then there's moral decisions for the community. Then there's moral decisions for the nation state. And then there's moral decisions that have a domino effect on a multilateral effect on the entire world. And if you're only thinking philosophically in terms of one of those levels, then you're really missing the whole. And very problematically, if you get really good at that level one, you may think you're really smart at moral decisions on level 5, which have nothing, and then you have overconfidence, and then you make bad decisions. And so I think for me, this topic of that you're getting at basically is what needs to replace things like the trolley problem.
So, Daniel, you're giving me so many ideas. I'm just jotting things down on my
Please, I've got all my sticky notes, because I also just want to note how many lines, and not to take it back, I'll let you speak, but just in your article, I had no idea that when a ballistic missile, it goes in the air and the engine turns off. I didn't know that, and that it comes down. You were missing the laser defense system. A lot of people have this kind of idea that we can shoot down basically anything with lasers. I understand that that is not the case. That we in the initial testing, we found out, correct me if I'm wrong about this, that the atmosphere had a much bigger effect on the lasers than we thought. That's crazy. Most people kind of assume that we can shoot down anything with lasers is not the case. So I just want to note how much in your article, and then on the topic in general, it's just fascinating to me.
Well, there's so many strands of thought there, Daniel, that's fascinating. But just to, again, bring a real world example to what you was talking about, the trolley problem and multilateral organization. So as strange as it seems right now, throughout a lot of the 2000s, there was actually a lot of interaction between NATO and Russia in an organization or a branch of NATO called the NATO-Russia Council, which is kind of defunct at the moment. But in order to have sort of not just a North American European branch to missile defense, but to have sort of a northern hemispheric defense, which was supposed to include Russia. And there was a lot of discussion about that. Unfortunately, it didn't get anywhere because of the sort of encroachments of, well, from Russia's point of view, the encroachments of Eastern European countries into NATO. on the ground, that physical reality of that undermined Russia's trust in this idea of this hemispheric defense. You know, because Russia was also itself concerned about North Korea attacking it, or, you know, like a rogue Middle Eastern state attacking it, or, you know, back in the 2000s, what if, you know, a terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda managed to secure Pakistan's nuclear missiles and launch them at Russia. So there was seen as a common interest, but it broke down, and it really broke down with the 2008 Georgia conflict, which might be, you know, in the distant past, but Russia again invoked as part of that, you know, missile defense. They weren't happy with ultimately with a lot of the Eastern European countries joining NATO, and then they just sort of threw in the towel with this hemispheric defense. So, you know, there was that attempt at multilateralism, which makes sense rationally, as we've discussed. You know, if everyone could club in together and defend themselves from true rogues or terrorists if they managed to get hold of nuclear weapons. But again, there was that nationalism, that element of the irrational, let's say, you know, people, you know, love of the motherland or fatherland or whatever, that undermined that. So I think that's one aspect of it. But just to come round to, you know, that philosophical aspect of it a little more, and Heidegger has a lot to say about this, because again, a few months ago I was doing a course on Heidegger with Johannes, you know very well, and there was a paper that I gave on that, which was about techniques, and I actually argued that in a kind of, not in a literal way, but that, you know, Heidegger says only a God could save us. Well, with the birth of the nuclear bomb, mankind sort of reached within the physis of nature and clawed out this terrible God for itself. You know, the Trinity test gave birth to this kind of new God of techniques, which almost literally has that ontological or ontic underpinning that God provides to our being, because by not allowing conflict, you know, we've got this mutually assured destruction, whereby if someone was to fire a nuclear weapon, you know, you could not win, you could not start. It's kind of underpinning, in a perverse way, our being today. The fact that Russia and the United States have nuclear weapons means that Ukraine can't escalate into World War III. So it's kind of underpinning my existence, your existence right now. The fact that nuclear weapons exist is stopping big wars from breaking out that could threaten an actual World War III. Because if it did happen, then we'd all end up dying, or it'd be such a Pyrrhic victory.
Well, I really appreciate the point that you're making. You know, very often when we talk about Heidegger and enfrainment and technology, we, you know, there can be discussion about how everything is now standing reserve, and obviously that's true. We talk about, you know, I like to talk about how before the camera was invented, you couldn't look at a sunset as a potential picture. Now, when you see a sunset, it's a potential picture. So your towardness toward the sunset is forever changed, for good and for bad. In some respects, it's good. Now you can capture that sunset and hang it in your office, but also it can be bad because you're anxious of, oh my gosh, I forgot my picture, I'm going to miss this sunset, and now the suchness of the sunset cannot hit you. So it's always trade-offs. You know, Neil Postman was always good talking about how technologies are trade-offs. They're good and bad. You can't say they're one or the other. But the point is, very often, you know, with Heidegger's enfrainment, there's this note, you know, we talk about cell phones, internet, and so on. You know, we need to think about military technology and enfrainment and ballistic missile systems, not just the internet, not just cell phones, not just Facebook, which obviously has indeed Deleuzian captured and framed, so on as we will. The very fact that you, I was thinking just the other night, because I somehow, you know, I recently did this wonderful symposium with Cadell Last on Hegel, and was going through elements of the philosophy of the right. And, you know, it really kind of occurred to me that until pretty recently, you know, only God could destroy the world. You know, it's very recent that, you know, that you know, for most of history, if the world was going to be destroyed, only God could do it, quote unquote. Now we can do it. And how radically does that change everything? You know, because I've been going back trying to understand the progressivism in Hegel. You know, how is Hegel progressive? I think there is a progressivism, but it's contingent, it's more tragic, it's more interesting. But the other point is, we have to remember, when Hegel is writing, there is no possibility of a conflict that could say in the world. at all. And so even if you say, okay, you know, because in Hegel, there's this idea of growing unity. Now, what's funny is the more people are unified, the more they tend to fight. You could get into Girard, similarity tend to create conflict. But, you know, as long as there's no possibility of, say, the world getting destroyed, eventually that will probably work itself out and unity will go through some turmoil, but then it will stay together. You know, we'll work through our differences. But it is important to note, I think we must remember that the word unity, we kind of have a bias where we assume unity equals utopia, when really I think there's plenty of room in Hegel to understand that increasing unity can lead to more conflict. It's just that you'll eventually get through that conflict, really. But then the nuke was invented. But then the drone was invented. And you see, I think it would be very interesting, assuming that understanding of progressivism in Hegel is correct. Now, again, I think it's a little more complicated. But generally, it would be fascinating to see how Hegel's thinking would develop today when you have a world where the nuclear bomb undergirds everything. Because in one sense, maybe the nuke is actually going to make a global state possible because you can't go to World War III. On the other hand, maybe it's precisely why you'll never get to that global state, because we're going to kill all of ourselves before we get there. Maybe you say, okay, Dan, but not the, well, what about the drone? You know, all in the drone ethics that you're talking about. I mean, if it's now possible for democratic states to go to war and not have democratic protests because soldiers' lives are not at line, you know, maybe a nation can easily just kill everyone else with their drone fleets, and you know, then you get a global state because there's no one else left except who's ever part of that union, that group, or whatever. So the Heideggerian, you know, there's two ways for me, like you're mentioning Heidegger, that are very interesting here, is precisely, I love how you're putting that we reached into reality and pulled out a god of the nuclear bomb, but it's a kind of Moloch. It's a sort of god of sacrifice or utter Sivia, sort of utter destruction that we've brought forth to unify everyone, you know, unity through thread. I guess that's kind of like Girard's apocalypse, but I'd have to think about that. But the other thing that's interesting too, when you're mentioning on Heidegger, you know, I always love that part where he kind of talks about a doorknob, where, you know, you don't notice a doorknob till it breaks and then you notice it. So it has to break, until then it's invisible. Another way I was thinking is that with missile defense systems, you know, they're invisible until something goes wrong and then you realize they're ultra important. But then at that point, it's almost like too late. And you see, that's sort of, to me, very interesting, is that now when it comes to, especially, and I really appreciate how you focus on missile defense systems, because I feel like those are in a, you know, you could bring up game theory, kind of a game theoretic, very interesting versus nukes. A lot of people talk about nukes, but you see missile defense systems is occupying in the space of where they're invisible, where you still have to make decisions about them that the general public may not understand, or that can only be understood on a multilateral dimension of rationality, not on linear rationality. All of that makes a much more complex and interesting picture. And so I appreciate how you bring that out. But definitely, I think the Heidegger, and to me, it's also interesting because a question I kind of go back and forth, and I'd be curious what you think about this. You know, Johannes has done such a good job of showing how death and being are connected in Heidegger. I always wonder if the nuclear bomb has made death further from us or closer, because it's so weird, right? You're exactly what you're saying. Like the nuke has made it to where we can't go to war. And yet at the same time, it's made it so we can't go to war because death is so apocalyptic. And so to me, it's almost like a Schrodinger's cat, where it's both the worst thing that ever happened to the reality of death, and also the best thing that ever happened to the reality of death, because at the blink of the eye, the world could end. So I find that so fascinating, because it's not clear to me, or it's something to think about, if the nuke helps us get closer to being by making us closer to the reality of death, or if it makes us further from being in the reality of death because it makes the cost of war so high. You know, I come to think of, like, in The Eternal Husband, that short story by Dostoevsky. And in Russia, as you know, when somebody died, they'd leave them on the table for, I think, 3 days, because there was this idea that the soul, it takes 3 days for the soul to leave their body. And so every day you'd encounter death and you would see the dead body. You know, in America, we put old people in nursing homes, we put people who are sick in hospitals. And I'm not saying that's necessarily bad. That's an entirely different discussion. But death is very far away from us, which arguably contributes to us not taking being very well. And so it's kind of interesting to think, what way does the nuclear bomb fall? Does it make us closer to death or further from death? I find that a very interesting, an interesting idea.
No, and I think that really ties in with the point you were making earlier about sort of the Democrats and you know how maybe that links in more with the use of drones and missile defense, because you know, Heidegger has this phrase: the frantic abolition of distance brings no nearness. Talking about, you know, we can fly everywhere in the world in hours, but you know, people aren't connected. Well, I think this is even more exaggerated with drones, with ballistic defense, with nuclear weapons. You know, we can sit in a booth somewhere, or our leaders can sit in a fortified bunker and decide death for millions of people in the world. So there's I think it's an even further disconnect between death. I think it makes it further away, up, especially drones. I mean, nuclear weapons are slightly different because the level of destruction is so great that even if you are the president in your bunker and you manage to survive the initial war, you know, what's going to be left? There's going to be nothing left. You know, you might have a nuclear winter that's going to be like hell on earth. But I certainly see that at work in what you were saying. I mean, if we're talking about drones for a minute, and PTSD. So drone pilots, they do tend to have less PTSD than normal combatants, because there is a difference. If you are a drone pilot and you are, in your Air Force base in Nevada and you're piloting something in Afghanistan, you are not at physical risk, and physical risk or seeing a comrade killed, something like that really has a big impact on PTSD. But what you will see in the literature around drones is there is a specific type of PTSD that drone pilots do suffer, which is whereby they are in their air-conditioned booth and they're maybe doing a shift, and then they drive a few miles home and they go and have lunch with their families after killing people all day. And this is more like a psychological trauma, because there is, at least if you're in a war zone and then you finish your tour of duty and maybe you've got like a 12-hour flight back from Afghanistan to, you know, the United States, something like that, at least you can decompress. But if you are watching people in high definition on a video screen and killing people, and then you go home at the end of your shift and eat dinner with your family, that's a whole level of trauma. Wow. And that's something in particular that drone pilots do suffer from.
Now that's really fascinating. You know, a few things in your excellent series on drone ethics. I know that there was this idea of the possibility of, you know, when you're doing drone warfare, it's almost unethical because the enemy cannot defend themselves, really. Where when you're on the battlefield, maybe it's, and you have that excellent video on Kant's categorical imperative, which I really liked, on this idea that at least in war, you know, the soldier who might be killing someone else, they are at risk as well. And there's kind of a question, is that more moral than the drone warfare where there's no risk to the other side? Is it somehow, I really like this question of, does war permit indiscriminate killing? You know, if there's a war, is it okay just to kill anyone at any point? Is it literally no rules? And I think that's really interesting, because I think a lot of people would say, well, yeah, I mean, war is just about winning. It doesn't matter how you win or anything like that. But arguably it matters very much that actually the rules of war are almost the last line of defense against the void, if you will, the apocalypse. And it seems like we kind of almost metaphorically might do ourselves a disservice to think about war as no hold back, anything goes, because that then leads to that. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, when really the rules of war might arguably be the most important rules of the most important laws of all, because they're the last rules, the last line of defense. It actually, as I was hearing that, it brought to mind one of my favorite plays, and then I'll comment on what you were saying about the post-traumatic stress, because that's fascinating to me. One of my favorite plays is A Man of All Seasons by Thomas More. It's a tremendous movie as well. I think it won the Oscar. And there's this part where the son is talking, or the son-in-law, or the husband of his daughter is talking to Thomas More and says something along the lines of, and I can't remember, the context is something like defending the law and the law benefits the devil. And the son is like, I'll tear down every single law if it benefits the devil. And Thomas More is like, oh, will you now? You'll tear down the law if it benefits the devil. He says every last one. He says something like, oh, will you now, Robert? And you're just the man to do it. If you were to go through and cut down every single law until there's no law left between except you and the devil, you've gone through the forest and cut down all the trees, and now you stand face to face with the devil. How then will you stand upright if that mighty gale were to begin to blow? How would you manage to stay on your feet? No, Robert, I will defend the law even if it benefits the devil for my own safety's sake. For my own safety's sake. And that came to mind because it's almost like the law that we hold that benefits the enemy, where we don't indiscriminately kill the enemy, so the law benefits the enemy, we actually do that for our own safety. Because if we don't have that law and all there is indiscriminate killing, then I don't see why we don't end up in an episode of Black Mirror or where everyone's using drones on everyone else. And so I think for me, it was kind of just going through your work, it kind of that connection with Thomas More, to me was really, and I'm grateful to you for it, to think about the law, the rules of law being about, for our enemy, for our own sake. And to think of it that way. And I was really grateful for that. I'm extremely interested too, when you're on what you were saying with post-traumatic stress. It reminds me too, some degree of like, I worked unloading trucks for a long time at a wholesale, for like 6 or 7 years. And, you would get in your car and you drive home. So there would be kind of, in a way, a disconnect between work is there and all the chaos and hard labor, and you come home and it's like a different world where having to drive home was actually kind of a good thing. It created a certain separation. In this example, what's so curious is the line between the war zone and the family life is completely torn down, where they become the same thing. And in some way, and that's also an example where efficiency, quote unquote, and convenience is actually dangerous because it breaks down the line between one and the other. And although compartmentalization can be bad, there's also a way in which it can be good, because it's almost like different ontologies, if you will. Like war is a different ontology from family life. Like work is a different ontology from being at home, and the ability to separate them is very important. So for me, driving home from work could be good. And I actually think we see this after COVID with all the people that worked at home and how it's actually not as easy as people thought, because it creates an entirely different psychological experience. So likewise, the ability to kill people with a drone and then drive home so easily, there's no decompression, if you will. And killing people is much more extreme than unloading trucks. So, it only, 15 minutes driving home was enough to decompress. But, killing people, that might take weeks or days or a very long time to kind of mentally flip. And now we can't, these poor people are not mentally flipping. And it's very interesting to think, although there might be a reduction of post-traumatic stress disorder, which can be good, there can also be a new, I wonder is there a name for it? A kind of, is it a schizophrenic, this kind of blurring of worlds where everything goes together and you can't tell the difference between where you are and what set of rules and what sets of principles you should occupy with, because that also too goes to show you, which kind of points back to the ballistic missile system, how we actually operate according to different rationalities relative to different contexts. And you need those different contexts to be clearly separated to know which logic and rationality you're operating by. Because if you start to blur them, you might start having family problems, or you might start having marital problems, because you're still operating according to a kind of emotionless state to the most extreme things. I would be curious. I have no idea. I'm just talking. If you go from, say, killing people, not thinking much about it, and going home, if your wife wants to talk to you about marital problems, is it hard to have an emotional reaction? Is it hard to take it with any sort of gravity? And so you're emotionally disconnected. I could see that occurring. I have no idea. I have no evidence. But to me, all of that points, and then I'll give it back to you, all of that points to the wisdom of what Heidegger was getting at about the consequences of kind of closing distances and blurring these spaces together. I find that fascinating on what you're saying. I had not heard that regarding the struggles drone pilots could have.
No, again, I'm not an expert in PTSD, but everything that you've said makes sense. One fact point that links in with what you were saying is there's a great a GQ article with a former drone pilot who experienced a lot of PTSD. It's on one of my, I think it's the Eremetic Warfare piece, the Plato's Cave piece. And what sent this particular, this gentleman over the edge was after he'd done his particular tour of duty for a few years in that particular unit, was being told his kill count, and he killed over 2,000 people. And again, this shows the acceleration of technology, that even if someone is a sniper, and they may have killed dozens of people, they've not killed 2,000 people. And even if those people are the enemy, and again, that's a very difficult point to make, because there have been some terrible mistakes made with drone targets. Just the sheer amount of killing that is possible through machinery has that negative effect on people's mental health.
Well, to me, what's a fascinating thought is, I guess you could call it the phenomenology of killing, where for most of human history, if you killed someone, you would see it, where it would occur to you. And so it was a very immediate feedback loop. You killed this person, you see it. Now, of course, I'm not saying that necessarily meant people repented of it. There's plenty of the Icelandic literature of the revenge cycles. There's plenty of examples of the violence. You could even take a book like, Steve Pinker's Better Angels to go through all of the horrors that people went through. But there's also something, it's just an example. I think, when I think about history, I think we have to be careful to think of it as progressive, necessarily getting better. I think it's different. I'm not saying it gets worse, but it's kind of different, almost so different that it's almost like an entirely new type of being. And I think that's kind of Heideggerian. I think we tend to think it's progressive, like necessarily getting better because technology gets better. But technology gets better just by virtue of trial and error. It doesn't get better just because we're smarter. It gets better because we've screwed up. We've had more time to screw up. So we're not necessarily more advanced. We've just kind of benefited by the virtue of trial and error that goes through time. Now that's not, and the same goes with knowledge. Knowledge, that tends to build on one another. It's not like one person wakes up and, goes back to the initial paradigms and builds upon them. They build upon the shoulders that came before them, on and on and on. So we have to get, we always, have to approach the world that we're in kind of now, and the kind of being that we have now. And you see, now we have a type of warfare that is able to create an entirely different phenomenology of killing. A killing where you can kill 2,000 people and literally not know it, and not even have an idea that you knew it, or even be able to grasp what that means. Or, it's possible to kill someone while eating a sandwich. That as mundane and silly as that sounds, that's actually pretty extraordinary, because in human history, it's hard to imagine a situation where you could kill someone while eating a sandwich. And now you could literally kill someone while eating a sandwich on a drone. So then the distance between eating a sandwich and killing people is gone. And so there's the possibility. So for me, what that means is, I was saying how now that we've invented the camera, every sunset is a potential photograph, right? Well, now that we have certain military technologies, it's hard to imagine anything that we can do that couldn't also be potentially done in concert with an act of death and an act of killing. Even like, as silly as it sounds, driving a car, being on a Ferris wheel, being in a boat, green eggs and ham or something. There's no situation anymore in which there is no potentiality by which to participate in death. How does that change our being? How does that change who we are? How does that change what kind of creature in being that we are? I don't know if we appreciate that. Is it good? Is it bad? Does it reduce the possibility of conflict? Does it make us closer to death or further from death? It's very interesting, because I am taken when Johannes is talking about kind of this idea that death and being are tied together. And one of the reasons that we have the meaning crisis is because we've lost being, that we're disconnected from being. And there's a if we're thinking about what's going on with Russia, and if, Putin is tied with Alexander Dugin, and Dugin's a big Heideggerian, and the idea is that Russia has to separate itself from neoliberalism in order to maintain being, to me, it's a question of, is the ability of us to say engage with drone warfare make us closer to being or further? It almost seems to make us further now, in the sense, because it's almost like if everything is death, nothing is death. And that's where, to me, it's so interesting. So when I think about the need to maintain a connection with death, which there are many, you can get into theology. There are many theological thinkers that talk about this. And I think it is indeed in Heidegger. It seems to be that there's something about that that's actually very tangible, that's very personal, that has an emotional connection, that if we lose that, it's almost like the worst of all possible things. Wow, now that's extreme. But it's like where we're now able to engage in death on such a mass scale, but it's almost like not death at all, because it doesn't have any personal or emotional connection. And then these soldiers, what it sounds like is they're coming It's like they're being forced to realize this is the nature of the world now. And they're like on the vanguard. They're like on the front facing it. Wow, the world is now a place where it's possible to kill 2,000 people while eating a sandwich. What kind of world is this? What is the kind of thrownness that we are now having to learn to come to terms with? How do we come to terms with it? Are we better for this? Or are we worse for this? And I think, again, to point it back to and then I'll give it back to you. I think a perhaps unawareness of or a disinterest in military strategy, military technology, foreign affairs, politics, all these things can contribute to philosophers not paying attention to these subjects and talking about these subjects, which arguably are incredibly critical to discuss, so that as it becomes clearer to the entire globe that this is now the state of our being, that people are ready for it and they're able to handle it and come to terms with it, as opposed to not being able to handle it, and maybe different glimmers of it is contributing to the meaning crisis and different things like that. So to me, it all kind of comes together in that sort of picture. Like, what does it mean to be a being in the world if the world is a place where you can eat a sandwich while killing people? You know, what does that mean? Are we closer to death? Are we further from death? Are we closer to being? Are we further from being? I think what you brought up, a Heideggerian reading of this situation, is fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that's where the drone ethics, and I've been fascinated by that book, of which my digests are based on, Gregoire Chamayou's drone theory, 2015. I can't recommend that book enough. It's so fascinating because it's so well written. He won an award for that, because it really combines the philosophical with the technical in a really engaging style. I think his hero must be Foucault, because he's really graphic in the examples that he gives, but it also combines with you know, the philosophical and the technical and the legal. But on that point about killing and death, I think that's what Chamayou is trying to do in that book. What he's trying to do, and I think he's almost trying to play a double game in a sense, because when you read into Chamayou a little bit more deeply, I think he is a leftist. I think he's a leftist, but he almost tries to, he plays a based argument. You know, we hear this phrase based. He tries to use a conservative argument against drones, against technological killing, because he reaches back to Clausewitz and says, no, you know, combat, honorable combat is whites of your eyes. It is where you can see the enemy. And this actually reduces conflict, because if you can see the enemy and you are at physical risk yourself, suddenly the stakes are so much higher. And this is what war should be like. And this is ironically a way of reducing warfare, whereas with drone warfare, with nuclear weapons, with missile defense, we can, or elites can, at least shield themselves from the immediate effects of war, and it's either the public or it's the drone pilots that are experiencing the reality of it.
You know, I'm so glad you brought this up, because I was, let me ask you this. Do you feel as if he is concerned about the possibility of almost like a neocon liberal party emerging, or where it's like a pro, and when I speak liberal, I'm talking America, you know, Democrat and different things like that. It's almost like the problem with drone warfare is he sees the possibility of a neoliberal, I'm thinking like neoliberal, neocon, like a neoliberal that's okay with conflict, that's okay with war, because it removes the soldier, not realizing that could arguably be far worse than invasions, even invasions into Iraq or different things. Now, that's a different subject. I'm not going to ask him to say which he thinks is worse, but it's almost like he foresees this possibility of a very pro-violence liberal party that's emerging. Was that your sense of his work?
Yes, he definitely is in that strain.
Not to put you on the spot, I gave you a loaded question. That was not my intention. It's a sense I got.
He definitely is in that strain, because some of his other works, he's got a more recent work called The Ungovernable, and it's very much about, or a title to that effect, and it's very much about the sort of neoliberal consensus. It's an economic book. It's not a book on conflict. But
I said neoliberal and realized that neoliberal is the economic term. So I was trying to think of neocon, neoliberal, like a parallel to. Sorry.
No, but I know exactly what you mean. But this is something that I explored quite a lot in my PhD thesis. This is where we do need to be multilateral, because so far we've been focusing on a lot to do with the top down. We have been looking at this from a neo-realist perspective in international relations. So neo-realism in general, and it's a loaded term, because there is a real nature to of a particular type to international relations, but it assumes that because states are all states are in a state of Hobbesian all against all. There is no power above states that can force them to conform. You know, there's the United Nations, but that can't really do anything. So it's literally, you know, power between who's the most powerful, the United States, Russia, China, whoever. But this kind of anarchy, it actually generates a rule-based system because they kind of like balance each other out. Now, I think that takes us a long way in terms of why states behave the way they do, because all states need to maximize power. But specifically with democratic states like the United States or Britain, we have to bring the political back in. So, for example, this leads back to your point about, you know, why do drones, why do ballistic missile defense, why have they been supported by centre-left parties like the Democrats in America or, you know, New Labour in the UK? And I think that is because centre-left parties are always on the back foot in terms of defence, electorally speaking. If you look at the United States and Britain, any opinion polls will say that you know, the Democrats or Labour are always distrusted more on defence issues than are the Republicans or the Conservatives. So it's almost been like this desperate attempt to look tough on defence in order to outflank the Conservatives or the Republicans and win votes. And that has pushed them towards these less publicly involved forms of combat, which Chamayou points out. You know, if you've got drone warriors, you've not got soldiers out there fighting. More because that alienates their base, because you know, you've got a lot of the base voters for, you know, Democrats or the Labour Party who are against war in general. But obviously the parties have got to appeal to swing voters who may be more concerned about, you know, threats to the United States or Britain. And that's not to say in any of this that there aren't real threats to the United States and Britain. I think there are, and I don't write any of this to poo-poo, you know, drone pilots or people in the military or anything like that. It's just kind of an analysis of what's going on. But I think that's what's going on with these in terms of the Democrats and sort of this neoliberal conservative consensus over these issues, is that they politically they appeal to the part of the electorate that wants more defence, but also they don't alienate as much the base of these centre-left parties because to a certain extent, and as we've talked about with Heidegger, they are disconnected from the social base.
Well, that first off, I think, you know, you're talking about the necessity of politics, political overlap, political consideration, different things. It would be an entirely different subject, but, you know, obviously I'm not you know, I don't enjoy politics or different things like that, but I think it's entirely, I think we're getting to a point now in the world where like people like hate politics, like politics is basically evil, you know, and it's a really bad thing, when arguably it is a necessary situation by which to negotiate difference and to do it without conflict. You know, there's that line where, you know, war is politics by other means. Well, that would mean politics is war by other means. And, you know, which would you prefer? And so it's important to take these into consideration. Now, that's a tertiary point. The thing I wanted to get at that's interesting on what you're saying is how, you know, one of the things that I like to write on and talk about is the problem of thinking in terms of autonomous rationality, which is that there's a single rationality that everyone who's smart is going to come to terms with, and that then the world will be made more rational, and then there's a conflation of rational and best, rational and true, and so the name of the game is just to make everyone more rational. I think this is very problematic. It leads, you know, it would, David Hume warned how it led to totalitarianism, because basically there's one rationality, and if you don't follow it, you're not even fully human or you're stupid. And whoever controls that rationality then can totalize it upon everyone, and there's a lot of problems. And it's kind of a hangover of the Enlightenment. You could get into Adorno and Horkheimer on dialectics of the Enlightenment, so on and so forth. what the example that you're giving, I find very interesting, because when you're talking about politicians supporting missile defense systems, so it is rational to do that in order to outflank the Conservative Party so that you get the votes and get into power, right? But you may be supporting a missile defense program that agitates a foreign nation on a political stage, and thus is irrational in that sense. So it's rational in the political sense, but it's irrational on the geopolitical sense, on the global political sense, right? It will not do. This is another example why I really want to get rid of trolley problems and replace them with like things like this, like missile defense problems. There is not a single rationality here. Because in order to have a unified rationality, you would literally have to get the average voter to understand geopolitics, complicated, nuanced geopolitics. This is not going to occur. Not because, I'm not saying it's because the citizens are stupid necessarily. I'm saying that they're the ones who are driving the trucks that are getting you the stuff at your coffee shop. They're the ones who are taking care of they simply don't have the time that maybe the academic might to understand these issues. We don't have to, it's very problematic to assume that the average person doesn't understand geopolitics because they're quote unquote stupid. Maybe they are, but it's also just a matter of time allocation. You know, a lot of people who are growing our food may not have the time to say, understand Huntington or Kissinger's or so on and so forth. So the point is that it's practically impossible for the average person to understand the complexity of geopolitics. And also, even the experts of geopolitics don't know for sure how Russia is going to respond. They don't know for sure what North Korea is going to do. There's probability theory involved. So it simply won't do to think in terms of mere rationality and what is the rational course of action. Because what's rational politically, which then you see the thing is, if you're not in power, then you can't do your policy. And let's say that your policy is in fact what's best for the country, like objectively speaking is best. But in order to do that, you have to convince people to vote for you by supporting something that could be geopolitically dangerous. What's the rational course of action? It won't do to simply think in terms of a single autonomous rationality. There are different levels of rationality that are operating, and you have to think through all of them on a systems level and according to different systems and different things like that, which to me, the example you're making is just further reason why, I've already said it, to get rid of the Dern trolley problem and replace it with, ballistic missile systems and different things. And I think it's very interesting to think of politics in the UK in terms of the Labour Party trying to outflank conservatives, but to also think of it again, like if I'm thinking in America with the Obama administration, because Biden, he's president now, he was vice president under Obama. So one would assume that he shares in some of the military thinking of Obama. Why is it that drone warfare is different? Why? And if indeed it ethically and phenomenologically strikes the Democratic Party as different, you may have a conservative party in America that's okay with military invasion or action. I'm not saying they always are. Under Trump, things have changed. They're supposedly against the war in Iraq, and that would be a different topic. But then you have a new kind of support of military activity that is subtly developing on the liberal side that is not appreciated because drone warfare fits within the quote unquote progressive vision Thomas Sowell talks about that makes it permittable, whereas other types of warfare don't fit in the progressive vision and wouldn't be permittable. There's a transformation. And there is an example of where military technology, political vision, and philosophy are all emergently operating together to give rise to a world that is different from what you would have assumed based on what was occurring, in the past. So to me, everything you're saying, and I'll give it back to you, is operating on these different levels of rationality, which strategy, military technology, all of these things bring out that I think that your work is capturing and just very, very important.
Oh, thank you. And just on that point, I think when you're talking about those different levels of analysis, so you've got the structural level, which might be the structure of international relations and the structure of domestic politics, whereby a party's got to get elected to put its policy into action. You've got agents who, political agents, prime ministers, presidents, etc. But then I think where the more irrational aspect comes in is with discourse. And I think discourse is kind of like a meta structure which frames the way politicians believe they can act, whether they can actually have these choices or not. They have a framework which they believe is the only way. And I think this is shown, in my thesis, this is shown with what happened with Labour and ballistic missile defence, because there are these two really strong discourses that are held by politicians in the UK. One of them is the special relationship. So the special relationship is this idea that, you know, through a shared culture, shared history, particularly with World War I, World War II, you know, the United States and the UK have this role as sort of vanguards of the democratic order, you know, the Western order, and that it's absolutely paramount that the British government allies itself with the United States, for good or bad, because ultimately by allying itself with the, you know, the world's most powerful country, that maximizes the UK's defense. Then we have another discourse which is called, it's a bit more woolly, but it's called British militarism, and it is shown through opinion polling that the British public, and it's the same in America as well, as we've discussed, they broadly like political parties that are strong on defence. Now you marry those two together, and the Blair government has this idea that yes, we want to go along with the Bush administration and ballistic missile defence. We want to go along with the Bush administration and the invasion of Iraq. But strangely, what you will find is that in general, although the British public are in favour of sort of defence being strong in general, they were actually opposed to ballistic missile defence. They thought it would make the UK more of a target. And you know, the Iraq War, although it was supported mostly by the British public when it started, that was the downfall for Blair. You know, there's people that quip, if he hadn't have got involved in Iraq, he might still have been Prime Minister now.
Wow.
And it was really Iraq that did things for Blair, because you could argue that through hubris, through genuine commitment, he overstepped that idea that the British public were more in favour of, you know, of armaments than they actually were. and that's the irrational step, you know, that's what did for him.
Well, what you're saying on discourse, it brings to mind, you know, Habermas on his commutative rationality, on this sort of notion that, you know, discourse is this, I think that's a good way to put it, this sort of meta layer that has to be taken into a consideration. And a discourse is always quite interesting because discourses present themselves to the speaker as being self-evident in their meaning, but to listeners, they may mean something entirely different. You know, I could say ballistic missile defense system and literally mean a deterrent. Someone else could hear an aggressor. And, you know, so they would hear that I would be pro-war when really I might be doing it based on my intentions in order to stop conflict from occurring. Or maybe I would say, well, the reason we want to invade Iraq is in fact to make it more peaceful, for example, right? Where someone else would say, no, you're being an aggressor, or different things. So how do you define things? This, though, one of the critiques I would have with Habermas, and I generally, you know, to be clear, I'm a fan of the notion of taking discourse serious. I think it's very silly to not take discourse as a meta layer into consideration on one's strategy, political strategy, military strategy, and different things like that, because words don't tell you what they mean per se. You know, they seem like they do, but they actually don't. You know, Cardinal Newman had that funny line when he's talking about the Bible, and he said, you know, the problem is that words, you know, words don't tell you what they mean, and the idea is that you have to interpret them. But the problem is, of course, that, you know, interpretation is what other people do. You just read, right? So, you know, the same goes with discourse. The reason why you have to, if you don't think about discourse as a meta layer, you're thinking about just something you do and it's self-evident and everybody knows, but no, you need to be able to step back and see the mechanisms of discourse, how people understand it, how they're interpreting it. And if you don't take that seriously, you're going to lose the election, or you're going to cause a conflict with another nation, or different things. But that's where, regardless of what one thinks about Henry Kissinger, I was always taken when he's describing, I think in his book on China, where he said when he went with Mao that they would sit around and for the first few hours sound like old college professors, describing what is your philosophical interpretation of human nature? What do you mean by justice? What do you mean by freedom? And he was kind of telling a joke, but to me, I found that very interesting, because he was basically saying that the only chance discourse with China, with Mao, had any chance of being successful is if you first spent like a day or two defining your terms, or defining the very nature of the discourse. And he basically was saying that if you don't do that, you're doomed, because everyone's going to assume what the other side means by certain terms, what they want, and things are going to go wacky. They're going to be very problematic. This would be an example to me defining terms, understanding the structure in which a discourse is occurring, all to me, that's a very philosophical act. That's a very hermeneutical act, where you're trying to understand what people mean, what people intend, how people interpret things, and so on and so forth, which is a way of, I've been talking a lot of how philosophy could benefit from taking into consideration military strategy, politics, and so on and so forth. But this could be an example of the reverse, where, say, politics and military strategy and foreign negotiations and so on could benefit from being a little more philosophical. It's always a dialectic, because I'm Hegelian in that sense. It's always a bothness of going back and forth. I think I'd be curious on what like for me, one of the reasons I did that piece on Russia and Alexander Dugin and all that is because, it's very easy to sit back and say, oh, Putin is just an aggressive totalitarian who wants to bring back the Soviet Union. Well, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that he's not a crazy dictator totalitarian person. But to me, it's always a healthy exercise. And I think philosophically responsible to say, okay, if that's true, that's true. But let's see if there's a rationalization or something like that, that's kind of more philosophically grounded. So what is the logic by which a Putin is operating according to that would make it to himself not a crazy dictator or something else, that would make him actually noble or something? Because most of the time, human beings, if they are acting like jerks or they're doing something immoral to themselves, they still interpret what they're doing in terms of somehow it being good, right? That's kind of the old St. Augustine idea that there's no such thing as a bad intention, because whatever we do, we think is good, even if it actually is bad. If we think it's good to murder, if we think we should murder someone, then we think somehow it's good to murder them, right? And so on. So for me, taking that seriously means you say, how do we understand the logic by which someone like a Putin is operating according to, whether it's true or not, whether it's complete or not. And to me, that's a philosophical act where you say, okay, well, let's look at Putin. Okay, let's look at Alexander Dugin, because supposedly Alexander Dugin is the mind of Putin, whether that's true or not. Well, for Alexander Dugin, very Heideggerian, the West has created a form of being that turns the whole world into to put this very, very, very generally. The West, neoliberalism, which is a very difficult term because it means a lot of things to a lot of people, ergo the need to define our terms, the meta dimension, just like we're saying with discourse. For Alexander Dugin, the West has created a form of being that turns everything into standing reserve. The West, through globalization, is forcing everyone into this form of being. Therefore, Russia has to separate itself into kind of the new, I think he talks about neo-Eurasianism. I always get that term confused. Dugin will talk about land societies, water societies. He's got a lot of terminology. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm able to keep it all together. But the general idea is that we need a bipolar world, a world that splits itself off from neoliberalism so that it can avoid this way of being that reduces everything to standing reserve. And Dugin reminds me of people like Burjayev, who I understand Putin is making everyone read, who talks about the spirit of humanity, the meaning of the creative act. So there's this notion of kind of separating Russia from Europe, from America, to avoid this type of being that turns everything into standing reserve. Whether that's true or not, that's an entirely different matter. But the point is, for me, it's important to carry out that process to understand how people like Putin or Dugin might be thinking, so that then the discourse that one could have with those Russian minds would not be based on misinterpretation. Because if you have a discourse of pure misinterpretation, well, then the likelihood of that discourse not giving rise to unintended consequence, say World War III or something like that, is much, much less. And so to me, what you're saying about the notion of discourse as a meta dimension is so important, because if it is not taken seriously, then the likelihood you end up in unintended consequences, or let's put it this way, to avoid escalation, or to avoid having to politically support a policy that on the geopolitical theater has unintended consequence. All these things become much more likely. These bad unintended consequences become much more likely if you don't take discourse seriously as a meta dimension.
This is what's so great. I'm really enjoying this conversation, Daniel.
I am as well, Mr. Sempi. I'm going to keep you from, I know you have holiday. I'm going to keep you all day because you're just fascinating. I love the topics you explore.
You're fascinating too, Daniel. But just on that point you were making there, what's been really good is, again, you've gone to the philosophical level, the meta level, but it's reminding me of practical things which really flesh out what you're saying.
Excellent.
So for example, if we are talking about Dugin and Eurasianism, etc.
Yeah.
And the threat that an increasingly NATOized Eastern Europe presented to, Russia from Putin's perspective. This is where the idea of a certain level of being, a certain notion of Russian being, comes into conflict with the rational, because there is no way that the kind of systems that are present in Europe right now, and the Aegis ashore in Romania and the one that's coming online shortly in Poland in the next few days, could do anything to threaten the superpower of Russia and its nuclear weapons. But this is the thing. As the Ukraine conflict has demonstrated so tragically, Russia, the only thing that still makes Russia a superpower is nuclear weapons. So they are absolutely desperate to counter, and maybe they are over exaggerate or over interpret the power that ballistic missile defense has to undermine that capacity, because there is no way that any ballistic missile system would be able to counter. It might be able to counter a dozen missiles. It might be enough to deal with an Iran or a North Korea, but it cannot deal with thousands and thousands of missiles that Russia has.
Right.
And the other thing about it is, as well, is if NATO, the United States, was to build more interceptors, it's actually way cheaper just to build nuclear missiles.
I didn't know that. That's fascinating. Yeah,
so one of the things about people who would say that ballistic missile defense is bad is because it is way easier it's way cheaper to just build more nuclear missiles than it is to build ballistic missile defense by a magnitude. And even sort of in the 80s, etc. It's as easy as the ballistic missile defenses are quite easy to fool. They've got more sophisticated over time, but basically, if a country, let's say Russia, was to fire an ICBM at the United States, and each of these ICBMs has 8 nuclear warheads on them. Once that missile gets into space, and they call it a bus because it carries these nuclear warheads, you could literally have 7 decoys and only 1 nuclear missile. And these decoys could literally be, this is what the planning is, this is the prototype that came out, literally an inflatable nuclear warhead. That's all. It's just made out of plastic. But because it's in space, everything's traveling at the same speed, and to a radar, it looks like a normal nuclear warhead. So you might fire your ballistic missile interceptors, and all they end up hitting is these inflatable warheads. Wow. And the real one gets through. It's quite easy to fool them, even with modern technologies.
So interesting what you're saying about the cost of building nukes and interceptors. Is it true? Because I was reading up on Russian deterrent, interceptor systems. Is it true that Russia's system is basically almost to launch a nuke in the atmosphere to disable other nukes because of the electric pulse weaponry? And is, because I was reading up on that, where some people were saying that it's better just to build nukes and to like detonate them in the atmosphere, because then the electric pulse is going to wipe out all of the missiles that are coming. Of course, there's still the fallout that comes back on your own people, so it's not optimal. But now it's kind of making sense to me if it's actually an economic issue. Is that true that some nations have considered that? I don't know. I'm just speaking.
So I mentioned earlier on the ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 1972. What that actually allowed was, it allowed the United States and Russia to have one ballistic missile base, anti-ballistic missile base. I think it was either they could have it outside the capital or somewhere in the country. And the United States chose, this was in the 70s, they chose not to have any of them. They didn't go ahead. But the Russians have had since the 1970s a ballistic missile defense system outside Russia. Outside Moscow, and it's still there. And it was, I'm not an expert on that, but I've read a bits about it, and it was pretty primitive. And in terms of cost benefit analysis, I believe that's the system that they had. that basically if you, instead of trying to, you know, have computers that calculate exactly where the missile's coming in, you just kind of have a ballpark figure and you blow up a nuke that, you know, it sends out this shockwave in, you know, several hundred miles,
right.
And that knocks it out of the sky. But that was something that the Russians either had, or that was their bag, so to speak.
Interesting. So rather than necessarily be an economic consideration, it was more of just what they had at the time, given the treaty.
It was, but it's also cheaper.
So it is, yeah, right. See, that's what I find so interesting, because I was, you know, reading about that. I was like, oh, well, that's kind of interesting, but it's because there is an economic element, and it was what Russia built, given what they were allowed on that treaty. Well, that's fascinating. The other thing I wanted to note, so two things. One, this goes to show you too how, you know, both the nuke and the ballistic missile defense are a kind of deterrence. They're a kind of defense, right? And yet the kind of being they generate, the kind of framing that is different. So they're the same in terms of their end, but they are not the same in the kind of psychology, the kind of being that they generate. So right there, I think, kind of suggests the wisdom of what Heidegger is getting at. The other question I was to get at, because we're talking about discourse, I sometimes wonder, you know, metaphors matter. You know, there's that great book by Susan Sontag where she talks about how, you know, we really kind of screw ourselves when we talk about the war on cancer, because then people get cancer and they feel like they're going into war, so they lose hope, when, you know, cancer doesn't even kill as many people as heart attacks. And she's like, you know, that's an example. It's called Illness as Metaphors, I think, of the book. And she's like, you know, it's really important the kind of metaphors we use to describe illness, because that transforms how people relate to the entity, and in very bad ways. It could hurt the discourse, you know, where actually, you know, I know people, you know, really literally the psychology that people have, not that I'm saying you can reduce it to psychology, but psychology can go a long way regarding illness. Now it depends, and you could, I don't want to get into some sort of new age, Victor, you know, purpose is going to like change the nature of reality or something, but it's interesting how psychology has a really deep way. And the thing that I wonder sometimes, it's like you were saying, like, you know, I was seeing, I guess, on RTV where they were talking about the new ballistic missile systems, and they literally are talking about it as if it's aggressive, as if it's literally like shooting freaking artillery shells into Russia or something like that. And I wonder sometimes if the very name of ballistic, you know, missile system contributes to how easy it is to misrepresent what the system does in the political discourse, both for good and for bad, because it sounds like almost out of the, I remember when I was a kid, we had a video game called Red Alert, and you had these boom, 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 these missiles that would shoot and take out the enemy, where really what ballistic missiles is, like you're saying, they're an interception system. They're not like artillery shells that you're going to then have a position over Poland and shoot into Russia or different things. So I sometimes wonder, I don't know how you'd react to that, and I'm not trying to give you a loaded question, but it's funny to me sometimes, because I've heard people talk about missile ballistic systems as if it's kind of like artillery shells and we shouldn't support that or different things, not really understanding that you're talking more about a system of interception. I almost wonder if it needs to be called kind of the interception, an interception system or something like that.
No, that's exactly right. And there are, if we're talking about words framing being, there are several different schools of ballistic missile defense depending on your framing. I mean, the usual one, the main one is comes back to Reagan, and which is called the disarmament school, and which is generally, you know, what the stance of the Western powers, and probably Russia and China, towards nuclear weapons is, we wish they didn't exist. We want to try and multilaterally get rid of them, but while aggressors have them, we will keep them. Mm. The disarmament school, which was held by, or as it's called, the disarmament approach, let's say, to ballistic missile defense, which was, you know, quite widely held by Reagan, was this idea that with ballistic missile defense, we can use it to disarm. If the world would, if we could all end up with ballistic missile defense, then we wouldn't need nuclear weapons at all, because we would all have a shield which would protect us. At the opposite end of the scale, you've got the warfighting school, which has always been a very small offshoot. There were some voices that were a bit like that in the Bush senior administration, but where you actually use ballistic missile defense as a shield from which you can preemptively strike at another power. So you could start a nuclear war with North Korea, and then they might fire back at you, but you would be able to absorb that, and you could win that war. But that's always been a real minority. The bigger picture has been about trying to move towards complete disarmament in the long term. Another school which holds quite some sway is, I forget the exact name of it, but it's called deterrence by denial. So what this means is that it again relates back to the Iraq war. So if you have ballistic missile defense, if there is a country which has nuclear missiles, it preserves your freedom of action. So let's say Iraq had nuclear missiles, and in the 2000s, Britain and American coalition went in to invade Iraq. If Iraq had fired something against the United States, you would be able to absorb that and continue that war. But it's not a belligerent thing like with the war fighting school where you deliberately attack someone first in order to absorb their counterattack. It's where you've kind of got a shield which still allows you freedom of action against proliferators like North Korea or other smaller states. So that's definitely coming back to the point you were making about, how do you frame ballistic missile defense and what it's going to be used for?
Well, and it's just so fascinating because, words are so sticky, and words do our thinking for us. And, for me, when we start, if you were to say like a disarmament defense system, even like a reframing like that, then because there's this overlay of military schools of thought, politics, public, and all of these things overlay to create this kind of emergent, multi-leveled rationality that has to be worked out according to different rationalities, if you will, where then if everyone is constantly using the language of ballistic missiles, because what ends up happening is, although the long phrase is ballistic missile defense system, quickly that becomes ballistic missile defense, and then it becomes ballistic missile, and then it becomes ballistic missile system. You see the defense gets kind of left out, and then people are talking about ballistic missiles. And all of that then creates a certain sway on public opinion that then impacts. And I wonder sometimes, for example, where say if, we're talking about how the Labour Party gradually moves into supporting ballistic missile systems. If there's something where politicians, I wonder sometimes if politicians, and I know they all sit down in their war rooms, there's another metaphoric example, and think through all these different things. I wonder sometimes if they don't appreciate how much language frames being, that maybe they need to read Heidegger, that they would really make a point that every single time they talked about, say, ballistic missile defense, they'd make sure to include the defense. They'd make sure to include the disarmament, the ballistic missile disarmament system or something like that. Because if you're not careful in politics, and it's just the nature of the human brain, you know what you mean. We were talking about discord and how the problem is, you know what you mean and other people don't. The brain naturally compresses. It looks for, it takes long, complicated data and shortens it as much as possible to survive and get the gist of the matter. Well, gradually you tend to know that ballistic missiles are a defense system, or that's what you intend, at least. So you say it, and to you it's self-evident that that's what you mean, and that's what the public should hear. But that may not be what they hear. And in fact, ballistic missile defense system can become ballistic missiles. And then Russia hears ballistic missile system. And so then Putin is like, see, they're aggressor. We're just trying to defend ourselves. This is why we're having to do what we have to do. And then the discourse gets out of hand because there's not this attention to language, this attention to using terminology in a manner that does not create misinterpretation. I always was struck, we mentioned Russia, Chekhov, the great Russian writer, he once said, and Harold Bloom talking about Chekhov was saying, the reason Chekhov was such a good writer is because he understood that people who loved one another were constantly misunderstanding one another. He understood that the logic of relationships was misunderstanding. We tend to think that relationships are between people who fully understand one another. Nope. They are between people who are committed to one another and constantly misunderstanding one another and constantly misreading one another's intention. And that has to be really, and if you take that seriously, the attention you bring to discourse and to thinking and different things like that radically transforms in different things. So it's a point. Now, I wanted to ask you, your wonderful paper on labor and regarding ballistic missile defense systems. What is your take now on the political environment in regard to political defense system? And I'm not putting you outside your, to talk about current events, especially involving Russia and maybe in Europe in general, because I'm very interested interested on, you know, do people now say, well, we definitely need a ballistic missile defense system, or actually has it led more into the direction of nuclear proliferation or drone proliferation? You know, I'm curious how current events, like what direction is it feeding in? And I understand that might be speculation or different things, but I'd be curious what your thoughts might be. And that can also get into the Russian situation in general and its connection to some of your thinking.
Yeah, so I think, you know, a very concrete example of this comes down to this aegis ashore. Sorry, I should explain what that means. This ballistic missile defense system that's going to be switched on in Poland in the next few days. I can only see ballistic missile defense deepening, getting stronger. I don't think that's a bad thing, to be honest. I mean, I'm torn by this because my heart is on the Chomskyan left, sort of, so to speak. And, you know, that argument would be that these colossal amounts of money that have been spent on these armament systems should be spent on human development. Like if you wanted to stop terrorism or even terrorists acquiring a nuclear bomb, you know, you should spend all these billions of dollars on ballistic missile defense, on development in Afghanistan, and sort of drain the swamp that way, and then people won't turn to these sort of the terrorist groups. But I do think that it is a way, ballistic missile defense is a way of reducing the threat of nuclear war, because I do sympathize with that idea that you can have ballistic missile defense and reduce the amount of nuclear weapons you need. You know, even if you can't get rid of them entirely, you can reduce them by quite a large amount, because you could say, right, so maybe we've got, in the UK's case, we've got 400 at the moment. Maybe if we had robust ballistic missile defense in Europe, maybe we could reduce that to 10. Because even if you've only got 10, that's still enough to kill millions of people, as terrible as that sounds.
Sure.
So I do think that ballistic missile defense, although that sounds like a kind of centrist dad position, I don't know if that's a phrase that rings in the US, but is that a phrase that's common in the US?
The centric kind of like, what's the word? Lukewarm kind of middle sort of thing. Yeah. Yeah.
My heart is, no, we should not have these systems. We should be spending all this money on like reducing poverty. But my head kind of says, yes, you could use it for reducing nuclear weapons. What that will mean for Russia going forward, I don't know. I don't know. Personally, my interest in, you know, in writing my thesis, I see myself more as a political historian. I like to delve into things that have happened in the past and sort of tease out what were the agents and what were, you know, what were the structural factors, what were the politicians doing, what were the discourses that were around. That's not to say what I've been writing about doesn't say anything for the future. I would say that NATO will continue, will double down on ballistic missile defense, and I don't know how Russia will react to that. I don't know how Russia will react to that. I can't say that. But
well, I don't either, and I think first off, there are too many people who are trying to say what needs to be done in current events and what's correct. I think that's one of the worst tendencies that can happen with people who do academic work, because there is this tension of, oh, nobody cares what I'm writing about unless I'm saying about current events. And so then, you know, Hegel, I always find it very interesting at the end of the preface in The Philosophy of the Right, where he says, you know, the owl of Nineveh is flown. And what he means by that, you know, you really, philosophy is not so interested in what's happening today, you know, or trying to change the state or trying to change the state of affairs. But I think sometimes we have to take that whole paragraph into account, and it would be an entirely different subject. But basically, I take Hegel to be saying something along the lines of, hey, you know, if you're trying to change the world right now and using philosophy, and this would apply to history or whatever, to change what's going on right now, you can't change the world right now, but you actually, if you do your work well, could have an impact on the future. It's almost like, yeah, the owl of Nineveh has flown, but they left behind some eggs. And if we take care of those eggs, we can do something. Hegel, I think Marx really made a mistake. He kind of, when he says the point of philosophy is not to understand the world, to change it, I think he really misunderstood Hegel. And Hegel's basically like, to take to what you're saying on history, is basically like, your chances of actually making a difference is trying to do history well, because if you can actually get a good examination of what occurred, then you have a useful map by which you can follow the territory in the future. What ends up happening is people almost kind of a biblical double-minded. They want to do philosophy that's relevant, but also in the past, and they just suck at both. You know, it's like when people try to be, what's the term? Multitaskers. I don't know anyone who's actually a good multitasker. Everyone says they are, but generally speaking, multitasking tends to be a reduction of quality. Now, you can time block and do that well, where you say between 5 a.m. and 8 a.m. I write, 8 and 12 I do the farm, whatever, and that could be fine, but that's not the same as multitasking. So to your, I think it actually is important that people take seriously the fact that there can be a danger in trying to make one's work fit into different things. Now, that said, the other reason I think you're pointing exactly to why we need, I keep bringing it up, but I really hate the trolley problem. You can tell I really hate the trolley problem. What you're getting out right there is a true philosophical quandary. Do we pull the lever or not? Okay. Now, how about, do we build missile defense systems in order to reduce nukes, but that's going to take away money from alleviating poverty? What do you think we should do? Now, that's a real moral quandary right there. And by not having those in philosophical classrooms, because we're too busy with stupid trolley problems, we don't have people engaged in real philosophical, like philosophical tragedy, like tragedy being a trade-off of competing goods. For example, I might be getting the terminology incorrect, but I believe that the strategy of helping a nation's economy get better so that they don't go to war with you is called engagement. So, for example, I think America engaged with China under Bush and Obama because it's like, oh, it will westernize them. They'll become more like the West and will reduce the probability of conflict. But in order to do that, you have to make them stronger and richer. So if they ever turn on you, well, then you could have a really big problem because now they can be a true opponent. Well, guess what? Right now, it looks like engagement was really stupid because China seems to have become more aggressive. Now, how much is Western propaganda? How much isn't? I'm not sure. That would be an entirely different subject. But basically, the point is, it seems really obvious that engagement is a great idea when China is westernizing. But then suddenly when Xi Jinping declares himself basically lifelong emperor, they have the purification policy where they basically take out all the pro-Western people in government. And now we have these radical COVID lockdowns. Now it's so obvious that engagement was a stupid strategy. No, at the time it was a rational strategy. And do you really want to say, I mean, what are you saying? Are you saying that we should cut China off from the rest of the world and have billions of people in poverty? Is that really the moral thing to do? Really? This is an example where decisions are contingent, and that's where contingency is so important with, say, a Hegel. And I don't want to say that, it's this fine balance between saying, there is something to be said about prediction and modeling, but there also is a radical contingency. It just depends. It's kind of like, when the hurricane is out in the middle of the ocean, it's going to be very difficult to predict where it's going to end up on the East Coast. But once it's around Florida, you probably can draw a pretty accurate tale. So, there is, as you move forward in history, I think you can have more successful modeling. I don't want to be so contingent that I say all prediction and all everything is bad. Anyway, the point is that engaging with China being a good idea is contingent upon, say, for example, there never being a corruption campaign in China or Xi Jinping declaring him emperor of the world. If there never is, then engagement with China is a great idea. Likewise, if investing in ballistic missiles literally stops a nuclear conflict, then it was a great idea. And in fact, putting that money toward the defense system was a good idea, even if you couldn't treat poverty, because the alternative was the apocalypse. Oh, but here's the problem. Oh, crap. If the missile ballistic system actually succeeds at stopping the nuclear apocalypse, you never see the nuclear apocalypse to know that it was a great idea. So you always have to live with the anxiety. You always have to live with the uncertainty. That is another reason why I hate the trolley problem, because it doesn't teach you that you actually, when you're making a real decision, which is a tragic, difficult decision, there's always a discomfort. There's always a feeling of, I actually think that the failure to understand the true decision, I'm saying true decision, but I just mean these high level decisions that are really difficult. I think the failure to appreciate that those true decisions are always going to entail a certain level of disquietness, kind of discomfort, and different things like that, contributes to dare I say, popularism, or this totalitarian, this kind of extremism, political extremism. I think it contributes to that, because it contributes to people thinking that, oh, it's obvious we're just going to engage with China. Oh, it's obvious we should put money toward poverty alleviation, not missile defense systems. And so it's very easy to become a political extremist if you don't understand that these high-level decisions always are going to leave you with a feeling of disquietness, a feeling of awfulness. Yeah, and for me, you know, it's funny because that disquietness, that, you know, our brain kind of hates disquietness, like it does everything in its power to escape that feeling and to escape existential anxiety, because it wants to feel stable. You know, our brain is in the business of stability. But actually that feeling of disquietness can go a long way to fighting political extremism. Because, you know, if you understand that the choice between, say, fighting poverty and putting up a missile defense system is contingent upon what occurs, and no one knows what's going to occur, and it's very difficult. One, you become a little less certain about what you think, which actually I think is a good thing. You know, Leod Hand, he was an American judge or something. He said something I love. He said, the spirit of liberty is found in that spirit that's not too sure of itself. I always love that line, where he's like, you know, liberty and freedom requires a certain level of not being too certain that you're right. And that democracy doesn't actually tend to function very well if everyone is really certain that they're correct all the time. Because if they're certain, why would you bother to talk to people? You know, why would you bother to learn? There's nothing to learn. You know the truth, right? And then certainty as such feeds right into extreme popularism or extreme political points of view. And it would be, you know, then we'd have to get into what is populism, blah, blah. I understand that. But if we just take those language on political extremism, as I think we see today. So for me, this example that you're giving on this tension between alleviating poverty and putting up a missile defense system, engaging with China as opposed, I think the counter term is containment. I think it's containment is the other term. Then that's not easy. It's so obvious now, but it's not obvious at the time. And, you know, it's like look, this is a great example. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, you know, everyone was basically, you know, for putting money toward poverty alleviation, you know, taking it away from military spending. And then suddenly, everyone was like, it's so obvious that, you know, we needed to be building these systems. Well, now what? I mean, it's going to take a while to put these things up. So to me, I actually think that feeling of that unease, that uncertainty, as much as our brain hates it, is actually very good for the political discourse, because then we understand that we're always dealing with a contingency. And likewise, if it turns out that you make a mistake, you don't become so, how do you put it, so extreme in saying, well, it's obvious this was a mistake. It was obvious that the other side was stupid. It was obvious. No, it wasn't obvious. Because there are pros and cons to both sides. And thinking that way, this is what I meant to say. I never finished the point on Habermas's commutative rationality. For me, I'm very sympathetic toward the commutative rationality. My problem is that Habermas, and maybe he does somewhere, I'm not too sure. I haven't read all of Habermas, but my problem with Habermas is he does not go into detail on the proper emotional state people need to be in when they go into commutative rationality, which to me is everything. If you have people talking about their difference, but they have feelings of certainty, who cares? You know, it's not going to do anything. I also think Habermas kind of assumes an autonomous rationality, which I think is problematic. You know, if you have to have people that understand the nature of reality is one of tragic trade-offs, of uncertainty, and an inevitable feeling of disquietness, that's actually a good thing because it fights extremism. If people don't share that disposition, then the discourse is not going to do anything, dang it. And extremism is going to go a long way. So my critique of Habermas, now if Habermas happens to watch this and he's like, well, Daniel, in this letter I wrote in 1975, I addressed that point. I'm sorry, Habermas, I didn't read your letter from 1975. I'm really sorry. But from what I can tell, there's not an appreciation of the emotional and psychological state that are going into the discourse that is actually really critical for grasping the nature of these kind of complicated, multi-layered geopolitical decisions.
Yeah, and coming back on that again with another practical example, we're talking about Habermas, and then we were talking about the logic of misunderstanding. There's a concrete example of this related to, you know, the Bush administration and the Blair administration during ballistic missile defense. So just to backstep a minute, so you know, the UK is absolutely vital, eyes and ears, so to speak, for any nuclear missiles coming from the Eastern Hemisphere. So I mentioned RAF Fylingdales, which is like this big radar base, which if you could see it, it kind of like shoots out a dome of a sort of a radar detection area that's 3,000 nautical miles. Imagine like a huge dome like that. So any, you know, and that was set up in the 1960s. Any nuclear weapon that was launched would go pass into that, and it would alert the United States, because we were partnered with the United States, and it would alert the Royal Navy, and we would fire our nuclear missiles, which are on submarines. The Americans would fire their nuclear missiles against them. So there's Fylingdales, but because it's a radar, it can't see under the horizon. It kind of like shoots out in a straight line. So there's Menwith Hill, which is 20 miles down the road, these giant golf balls, and what that's doing, it's kind of compensating for that. So there's this system of satellites, and I'll get around to the Habermasian point in a minute. This links in with it. There's a system of satellites which are like 20,000 miles out in space, and they're sort of in geosynchronous orbits in various points around the Earth. And what they do is they sort of scan the Earth for any infrared patterns which would indicate the launch of a nuclear missile. And the one that is above Europe downlinks into Menwith Hill. So that's where you've got the radar, which kind of gives tracking, and you've got the space-based infrared system which detects the launch of nuclear weapons. Okay, so that's one thing. So we've got these are both updated in the 2000s, so that Britain is totally embedded in ballistic missile defense. What we also had was the United States wanted to put interceptor missiles somewhere in Europe. This is like in the early 2000s. There was a big push by the Blair government to try and get those interceptor missiles based in the UK. And basically through, you know, doing what the United States wanted with an upgrade to Fylingdales and Menwith Hill, and also not explicitly, but it's all within the same ballpark, you know, going along with Afghanistan and Iraq. The Blair government pushed and lobbied, and this is one of the things that I'm most pleased of within my thesis, because I spoke to former senior advisors in the Ministry of Defence and the Foreign Office, and they confirmed that these discussions did take place to try and have these interceptors in Scotland. They were going to be placed in Scotland. But the British government never actually managed to convince the Americans, because the Americans, even though there was this great, you know, alliance between America and the UK, the Americans ultimately chose what was in their strategic interests by placing them in Eastern Europe, because that meant they were nearer to Iran and the Middle East, instead of sort of having them back in the UK. It was better to have the eyes in the UK, but the arrows, so to speak. It's kind of like an archer, where you want them back a little bit so they've got time to aim. So yeah, that was the case of this logic of misunderstanding, whereby you've got the Blair government really pushing to have interceptors placed in the UK, and really thinking that because we've had such a strong alliance that the Americans would grant the UK that wish. But ultimately, the Americans went with what was best in their strategic interests and would make the system actually work better. So you've got that logic of misunderstanding there, which I think speaks to what you were just saying.
Well, again, one of the great problems I think I have with the doctrine of autonomous rationality, and of course it should be noted, basically everyone who hears it, you know, they would be like, well, I don't think according to autonomous rationality, and basically everyone would know that that's a mistake. The problem is what we practically do. You know, it's not enough to simply say, well, I know that fundamentalism is bad if you then practice fundamentalism, right? You know, the issue is that autonomous rationality tends to be something that people know, especially under pluralism, they tend to know is not real, but they actually still practice as if it's real. And what people believe is what they do, not what they say. You know, there was an actor once who, I can't remember which actor, he said something like, words are usually red herrings. I thought it was hilarious. He was basically saying that we tend to think that people say what they mean, but most of the time they say the opposite of what they think and what they mean. You know, words tend to veil more than to disclose. I thought it was hilarious. But you know, so likewise, we tend to believe what we do. And so, yeah, sure, everyone tends to know they're supposed to say that autonomous rationality is false and so on and so forth, but then they proceed to act as if autonomous rationality is in fact the case. And so what ends up happening is people go into these negotiations or even family debates or family discussions or marital discussions with a certain assumption that if everyone here is rational, they will do X, Y, and Z. And so they don't even have a category for a logic of misunderstanding. That's not even a possible event that can occur. And yet that is an incredibly substantial event that can occur in a marriage, between nations, between communities and different things, that if you don't even have a category, practically speaking, for a logic of misunderstanding, well, then certainly you're not going to know how to respond to it. Certainly you're not going to be able, if misunderstanding occurs, you are not going to have the resources to be able to interpret what happened as an example of misunderstanding. You basically have three categories, and there's a great book called Being Wrong by Kathy Schultz that I love that goes into that. Without the category of misunderstanding or different rationalities operating relative to what they believe is true that may not be true, you get three options. One, they're stupid. The people you're talking to are dumb. They're just not able to think. Second, they don't have all the information. They're misinformed. Or three, they're evil. There's basically three choices. They're stupid, misinformed, or evil. And so then you go around trying to understand all of geopolitics or all of family relationships or all of community relationships that don't work out for what's best. You then go in with three possibilities to understand them. And then you get a misunderstanding yourself, a meta misunderstanding of what occurred that does not help us in the future guide ourselves accurately on the territory. But this is an example where philosophy is actually very, very important for the political, for the geopolitical and different things like that, because philosophy will ask you, okay, hermeneutical questions, ways of interpretation. How is it possible that everyone could misunderstand a situation? I'm always fascinated by misunderstanding. Like, misunderstanding is phenomenologically fascinating. How is it that multiple people could look at the same thing and get different results? How is it that people could understand what's going on in one another's heads so wrong? And it's just so simplistic. It's so easy to say, oh, it's because they're stupid. Oh, it's because they're dumb. Oh, it's because they're evil. That's so simplistic. No. Let's really take seriously what Augustine said about there being no such thing as a bad intention. Let's really take seriously. I think it's funny because, you know, everyone's always talking. The whole thing about autonomous rationality that's so problematic is it actually doesn't treat people as rational enough in a funny way, because it's like you're either rational or stupid. No, what if every single person is actually rational relative to what they believe is true, but it's possible for what they believe is true to be false? Oh, that's a much more interesting picture. I like to say the true isn't the rational, and I've thrown water all over my screen because I'm so excited speaking to you and have now tried to clean it off. You know, there's this idea that for me, it's very important to realize that the true isn't the rational, that they're different categories. So what I mean by that is if you think it's going to rain today, it becomes rational to bring an umbrella. But let's say it doesn't rain today. Does that mean you were irrational? No, you were very rational to what you thought was true. It just happened to be the case that it was not what occurred. Therefore, it's possible to be rational and wrong. We tend to think that if you're rational, you'll be right. And this has messed up everything. But that is a philosophical understanding. That is an epistemological understanding that one brings to their economics or to their geopolitics or different things like that, and then interprets them in terms of that, which can lead to a failure of policy diagnosis, a failure to understand policy and different things like that. Like, so for example, when we're talking about Russia, if it was true that the West is in fact turning the entire world through its philosophy into standing reserve, then perhaps it is rational to create a system of self-defense against that neoliberalism that you divide yourself from. But if it's not true, that, you know, Dugin will talk so much about technology being an inherent metaphysic, that technology brings with it a metaphysics. And so it's not a consequential, it brings with it a certain sort of being. So then for him, he says Russia is acting in self-defense because the West created these technologies. They used economics to put them into Russia. So actually America and Europe attacked first. That's, of course, how he talks about it. Well, if you buy all of that is true, well, then, you know, Dugin's rational, right? But here's the problem. Is it one true that an alternative technology metaphysic is possible? 3, is it really the case that that enframement of being is fundamentally Western? Maybe it's any civilization who made that technology would be the same. Why is it, if laptops came from China, why wouldn't it be that that would just be Chinese being? Why is it fundamentally neoliberal or Western or different things, right? You're kind of grabbing things together. And I could go on. I would have to put together that whole critique of Dugin I'd like to do. Well, it's in the Thomas More thing, but a little bit more on that. But there's this notion that Dugin, if you accept what he believes is true, then you can rationalize, and then the line between being rational and rationalizing becomes quite thin, a certain self-defense that Russia is engaging with in separating itself from the West. It would be far simpler, though, just to say, oh, Dugin's stupid. Oh, Putin is stupid in different things. Well, then you don't have to do any work. Right? You don't have to do any work of taking into account. And when you don't do that work, the likelihood that you come to terms with good policy becomes much, much, much less. So for me, it's kind of funny because practically speaking, people who follow autonomous rationality end up practically denying rationality to people who think different from them. So there's a funny sense in which they're not even rational, like they're not even rational enough. And also I think we try to overfit the use rational, but that's a different subject. So it's kind of like funny because autonomous rationality ends up and is quite in its very autonomy, not ascribing rationality to anyone who thinks differently.
And I think that connection there between talking about Putin and whatever is, and Putin and Dugin, whatever their outlook is, and what happened with missile defense between Blair and Bush was people getting high on their own supply. So you talked about, people can either be wrong, evil, or misinformed. People can also be deluded into believing what, but getting high on their own supply, as I've said, and not seeing that their own assumptions, their own axioms lead them to an incorrect path. And they're quite smart, they're quite rational, but they're blinded by their own ideology. And in missile defence's case, this was the idea that the United States would grant the UK these interceptors, but in the final analysis, the United States was rational in putting them in Eastern Europe if they wanted that system to work to its maximum capacity.
Do you feel, I'd be curious on this, I feel, so there's all this talk about game theory and game theory increasing rationality. Do you feel as if sometimes game theory is used kind of to make people feel like, oh, we know what the rational outcome is and therefore it's going to definitely occur, and how that actually just leads people to being overconfident in certain results and that it doesn't actually work the way that they think it's going to work? I know it's a different subject and I've already gotten you for about 3 hours because you're so enjoyable to speak with, but I'm very curious as well on if you see any overlap between game theory dynamics that develop in academia, the work that you do in military strategy, and if you think it's a good thing the ways game theory have been integrated, if it's a bad thing, if it's a different thing. I'm curious if you have any topics on that subject, because I always now hear people talking about game theory in terms of defense systems and military deterrence and different things like that. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I feel like game theory, it's an area that I need to look at more. As we mentioned earlier, I feel like it's a little bit of a red herring because I don't feel, as you've mentioned as well, I don't feel conflict is ultimately rational. But in terms of ballistic missile defense and nuclear weapons, one strange assumption, which is kind of a game theoretic assumption, is that either side kind of assumes the worst case scenario. So if you've got ballistic missile defense, you kind of have to operate on the assumption that that system will perform as badly as it could perform, and the attack will be as good as it possibly could be. Whereas if you're the attacking state, let's say, you have to assume that the defense system will work as good as it possibly could, and your missiles will fail or something like that. That is a factor in how ballistic missile defense is operated and how it's designed, with so many fail safes and this potential hair trigger whereby the people who are against it say it can easily flip into massive levels of nuclear proliferation because, as we've mentioned, the offense is the easiest way to defeat it is just to build loads of cheaper nuclear weapons to overwhelm that system. But I'm afraid I wouldn't like to, I don't know enough about game theory to be able to speak much more detailed on that, apart from the fact that I ultimately don't think that warfare is irrational, no matter how you calculate.
Well, first off, I appreciate, one, you saying that, because we need a world where people say, well, I'm not sure. Second, I sometimes struggle with game theory. I'm no expert on it, and I don't mean to act like I am. I sometimes struggle with game theory because for me, there seems to be in academic departments this notion that game theory can increase rationality, when for me, I don't see why it doesn't. I don't see why the Nash equilibrium doesn't unveil the impoverishment of rationality. Like there's this notion of, oh, if we understand that you get a Nash equilibrium because everyone who's rational gives rise to a suboptimal result, therefore we determine true rationality, which is avoiding that suboptimal result. I don't see why that doesn't unveil that when people are rational, you can get a suboptimal result, ergo that rational and best are not similes, right? You see what ends up happening? I feel like game theory, now I'm just using that example, I feel like game theory should have been a revelation to the point exactly on what you're saying, that like the most extreme human enterprises cannot be purely understood in rational terms. Maybe on some big picture, macro meta systems level, you can talk about the ultimate rational course of action. Here's the problem. Nobody's God. So what good is this analysis? What are you telling me? No one could have known that at the time. Basically, what you're saying is, oh, but theoretically, it would be possible to create the ultimate AI system that could calculate the most optimal result. Well, one, you haven't overcome Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem to show me that that's even possible, but that's a different subject. Second, okay, let's say theoretically your computer could show me that X is the best of all possible courses of action. Well, the computer also has to do something else. Convince me that X is the best course of action. Emotionally make me feel like it is. This is a step I don't think people understand. Just because you show me the answer, that is not necessarily the step of me believing that that is the answer. So I'm not convinced that game theory is going to actually optimize systems, even if it could theoretically give rise to the most rational result, because if it's not able to present the best possible course as undeniably being the best possible course, then people can always doubt it and therefore not do it. So what are you trying to accomplish here? And again, I deny the possibility that that can even be done, because I deny that computers can calculate that level of emergence. Maybe if you develop quantum computing, blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, we'll use game theory for that when you develop me a quantum computer. Until then, game theory is going to be used to show that individuals can do what is rational for them and end up at a suboptimal result. Therefore, avoiding suboptimal results will require certain levels of non-rationality. You know, I like to talk about rationality, irrationality, and non-rationality, which is basically what you're saying. That conflict can only be understood in terms ultimately of non-rational and irrational choices, choices that are made on emotion, on probability theory, on what people feel, and so on. And that if you say, oh, they can be totally rationally determined, well, no, because let's go back to the example I gave. Determining that it is rational, and I'm losing my voice, alas, Mr. Simpkin, I fear I will have to bring this to a close because I could talk to you to another hour. But the point is the idea of that it was rational to bring an umbrella came after we thought it was going to rain, right? Well, that means we determine rationality after what we believe it's true. But wait a minute, if rationality comes after what we believe is true, how do we determine what we think is true? Well, it can't be purely rational, because rational is organized after truth. So it has to be by other ways of knowing: experience, emotion, memory. I'm not saying that rationality has nothing to do with it, but you can't reduce it to rationality, because what you believe is true is what organizes rationality. Ergo, rationality comes after truth. So non-rationality has to come. I'm critical of what I understand of academic game theory, because I believe that it should be a revelation of the necessity of non-rationality, when then it actually becomes in service of some sort of rationality, which I think just contributes to so many of the problems that you're talking about. Mr. Simpson, I am so sorry. I've had this voice problem for the last week. I want to keep talking. You're just absolutely fascinating. But I want to give you a chance to talk about your book that's coming out, where people can find more of your work. Please respond to what I just said if you wanted to, and just go into that. I'm so sorry to bring it to a close. I've enjoyed this immensely. We will have to do this again, Mr. Simpkin.
No, I have too. It's been absolutely fascinating. Just quick point. So yeah,
Please.
on the rationality point, yeah, absolutely. If everything was worked out game theoretically, then Putin would never have invaded the Ukraine, because it would have worked out in advance that he would have been.
Good. That's really good. Yeah.
And also, even if there was someone in his inner circle or in the outer circle that could present that game theoretic analysis to him, he obviously didn't listen to it, because his coterie are all frightened of him. And just one last point on the technicalities of ballistic missile defense. You mentioned, the cost-benefit analysis of shooting a nuke up into the sky and trying to knock things out by blowing it up. How ballistic missile defense actually works is, you launch this huge, great big ground-based interceptor, a big rocket, and it's got this relatively small thing on the end of it called a kill vehicle, which looks like a telescope strapped to a rocket pack. And this approaches the nuclear warhead up in space, and it's actually maneuverable. It's computer controlled, the kill vehicle, as it's called, and it doesn't blow up or anything. It just destroys the incoming nuclear warhead just by sheer kinetic impact. It just collides into it. So in that sense, it is a bit like shooting a bullet with a bullet. And of course, the problem is you've got the nuclear material from the nuclear warhead. Even though it hasn't exploded, it still sort of filters down onto your country. But yeah, they were the 2 points that I just wanted to wrap up with.
Excellent.
Yeah, in regards to my book, I'll keep posted. I'm excited to go through that editorial process. I submitted it to the editors a few weeks ago, so I'm waiting for their report back. There will be no doubt some things to do with that, but I'm just really excited about that process. I'm not bothered whether anyone reads it. It's just that as a reader myself, I would love to see a physical copy of my book out there, and I'll keep people updated. I'll send you a free copy, Daniel, when it comes out.
Well, you are a gentleman, and I know that feeling that you're describing. Well, absolutely, I would love to read your book. I'd like to have another conversation about that. I am so sorry to cut us off just because of my voice. I'm so sorry, because this has just been magnificent. I took so many notes. Your expertise in this field is inspiring, and I really appreciate it. It just opens new vistas of, and again, the work that you just do is important. I very much look forward to your book. And Microliberations is the name that people need to go and read. The work that you've done on the different subjects is fascinating. Your YouTube channel, and Mr. Simpkin, thank you so much. This has been a true delight.
No, absolutely, my pleasure, Daniel. You're absolutely prolific. You've got my brain just buzzing with ideas right now. It's been an intense, 3-hour conversation. Wow, and it's just flown. It's just flown. I can't believe it. So I really hope that our conversation hasn't harmed your voice, but it's been a fascinating evening. It's been a great way to spend a Friday evening, mates.
Well, I've enjoyed it, and indeed it is flown. So thank you. You're very kind, Mr. Simpkin. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Best to you, sir.
See you later.